Welcome to Out with Dan, the podcast that spotlights and examines the voices of LGBTQ+ authors, characters, and our allies. Together, we lift our voices and we tell our stories. I'm Dan White. Join me as I chat with this week's author. Hello and welcome back to Out with Dan. Today I'm excited to talk to Victor Lodato about Honey. Welcome, Victor.
Hey, Dan.
What a great read this was. I told you before recording, I sort of feel like it's a little bit of New Jersey noir or gothic. It's a great read. Can you give the audience a little bit of a setup for what the book is about?
Yeah, Honey is the main character, of course. And when the book starts, she's 82 years old. She grew up in New Jersey in a mob family and left quite young in her late teens to go to college, and then really never came home. But then in her 80s, after living for 50 years in Los Angeles and losing a lot of her friends there, she comes back to New Jersey to try to make some peace with her family, to put some ghosts to bed, and the sort of the fraught drama with her family kind of fuels the action of the book.
Well, I will say that I identified with Honey so much because I think Honey was my mom in a lot of ways. And so Honey has this internal dialogue that, and I will say this, and I don't mean this unkindly, but Honey's very judgy. She sees something, she's mesmerized by beauty. That's something I'm mesmerized by as well. Mm-hmm. So she sees something that's beautiful and she compliments it mentally. But when she sees something that's out of whack, in her mind, she has an ongoing commentary about that. I just loved that. I think it can be a little tough. Do you find that that's something you're blessed or cursed with, or is that something you experienced a lot?
No, not me, but I mean, coming from, writing as a playwright and then coming to novels, I like moral ambiguity and I like complicated characters. I mean, I like a character that is complicated and that maybe a reader might find some fault in them, but you have the whole book to get to love them. And so the book is a journey of coming to know Honey. And I hope by the end of it, you're madly in with her. And even despite her complications. And so I think it just makes it real, more human. Who doesn't occasionally judge, who doesn't have those faults? So Honey might be irritated. The book is also about some of the things that she's irritated by or the people she's irritated by ultimately become part of her chosen family. So there's this, the judgment, she has to rethink it over the course of the book. So, and I like working that way because I don't want Honey to be, or any character, even my main character, to be a saint.
And I think you did such a great job with it, Victor. I already loved Honey towards the beginning because I felt a familiarity with her. I felt like Honey was someone that I knew, having grown up with a mother very similar to that. And it's not something I find that I dislike. It's just part of how I was raised and the person I was raised by. And there's so much about family in this book, whether it's found family or, birth family. One thing that Honey says is sometimes you have to leave home to find home. And I found that was very true in my life. What about you? Was that something you had to do as well?
Yeah, when I'm writing a book, I'm not thinking about like how this is me, my story. I'm really focused on the character, but only later do I start to see the parallels. I think if I thought about them at the beginning, it would trip me up. But, Honey talks about how art changed her life, that, I grew up in a working class family with a lot of tough guys around me and a lot of what we call now toxic masculinity and, a lot of bullies. And Honey deals with that too. And she escapes New Jersey and reinvents herself in the world of art. And I feel like as a person who was kind of shut down when I was young, as a child growing up, because a lot of the tough masculinity around me, that it was through art, through theater and writing that, I found my voice. And I think it's the same for Honey. Honey blooms when she gets out of New Jersey and enters the world of, for her, it's fine art. She becomes an important figure in the in fine art and painting in the auction world.
Well, and I will also say I think Honey's is quite a muse in this book in so many different ways. There's so many things that she says along the way that really sort of tugged at my heart. I mean, one of the things she talks about when her friend passes away towards the beginning of the book, and someone tells her a wonderful story about her friend, and she says that, sometimes people become richer even after they die. And I think that that's very true in life.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we've all obviously had loss, and there's something about, I've experienced, especially with some of the women in my family and anyone really, friends, that, you know them when they're living at the point they exist. Then, they're 80 years old, and you know them, but suddenly after they die, you remember every era of them, and suddenly they're so much richer because they're not just that one age, they're suddenly every age that you've ever known them. And it becomes kind of psychedelic and just kaleidoscopic, and it just feels like they're suddenly everywhere and everything in every age. And so thank you, I'm glad that struck a chord for you.
It did. I mean, there were so many different things in this book. I made so many notes because one thing that I know is so true in life is secrets are inseparable from lies. I mean, we tell ourselves things that sometimes are true. And another thing is, so nostalgia is a lying serpent. So when I first read that, I thought the serpent was telling a lie. And then I realized later on in Honey's mind, the serpent is lying in wait for you. And I do think that about nostalgia. I mean, we are able to take in our mind something that happened in the past and make it so grand and so perfect and put it up on a high hill that we must return to. But can we ever return to it?
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly. I think, go ahead. I'm sorry.
no,
No,
I mean, I think it's this big grand scheme of things. I mean, your book made me think of so many deep things, and I loved that.
well, I think, I mean, I have Honey isn't inspired by any particular one single woman in my life, but I think as I said, in the situation I grew up with, I grew up in a household with both my grandmothers, living with
Oh,
me, lots of
okay.
great aunts, and so um, I guess in some ways, like a memory of those strong women in my Italian American working class family fueled it. So the book came out of some nostalgia, I think. But I think also, Honey, in coming back to New Jersey, finds that, that anything she glorified about the past has been a lie, and that time or distance hasn't healed a lot of things, and that she has to change. She has to change really who her family is, because it's a lot about a family you're born into and chosen family, and her consciousness has to evolve, and also I think she has probably some even nostalgia about who she used to be, and then when she comes back, she realizes she has a real consciousness shift about some of the darker parts of her own soul, and how she's implicated in some of the crimes of the past that she has been most of her life blaming others for.
Well, and I also think that what I saw some in Honey is there were times where she remembered the past and she remembered it correctly. But what I think softens her towards the end is the fact that she begins to realize that some of the things that she thought were so horrible maybe weren't quite as bad as she thought they were. And I know there is a rape in Honey's childhood.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I don't really think that Honey quite sees how that might have shaped her whole world. I'm not sure that she came to that whole realization. I saw it as a reader that I was like, well, of course you made some of these decisions in life because these things happened to you growing up. And
Mm-hmm.
it was a beautiful thing. There's no point in Honey do we get coshed over the head with religiosity, or you must remember this, or you must go this way. It was simply an unfolding of a woman's life, and it was so beautifully done. It was so lyrical to me.
Thank you. Well,
About
it's interesting because people often, I've heard this before, that it feels very organic, and that, that it doesn't feel like it's hitting you over the head with themes. And that's because, when I'm writing any book, and this has been true for all three of my books, I'm really not coming to it, I want to write a novel about this subject, or, or I want to get this point across. It really starts with voice, and Honey's voice was so strong in my head. And there were a lot of things like, readers will say with Honey, and then my past books, like with a particular character, I had no idea that this was going to happen, or that's who they were, or that would be the turn. And my response has always been, and it's true, is that, well, I didn't either. There's a trajectory, say, with Michael's character, Honey has she gets things wrong in the beginning, but so did I as a reader. So when we discover things later in the book, that the reader is discovering, I discover those as a writer too. It isn't a manipulation of the reader. It's really, you're witnessing sort of how my consciousness evolved in understanding the story. So I think that's one of the ways that, if I can preserve that for a reader, it keeps you turning the pages.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I started this off by saying that I felt Honey was judgy, and I do, but I also think that as we see Honey grow, we see the tenderness in Honey as well, in places that I'm not sure that Honey would have seen living in California. But when she goes back to New Jersey, she's sort of presented with some things that she wasn't really prepared for, and yet such a beautiful tenderness comes from that. And I just love that.
Well, I'm glad you said to me, and I don't know if it was before we started the interview, but you said, that there were things that made you cry. And I feel like maybe it's the playwright in me, but I feel like I haven't done my job unless people are laughing and crying. I want both. And I remember when I was a playwright at opening night, even if it was a very, a tragic play or a dark play, all my plays had humor in them, because I can't write dark stories without it. And I don't think in life, if there is no sense of humor in art or sense of absurdity, it almost feels false to me. It almost feels like a literary pose. Like this is so intentionally dark because the writer wants it to be a very literary dark book. But anyway, my point is, when I was a playwright and on opening night, I would be, even in a very dark play, I would feel great relief if they were all laughing at the right places. Because the only way you can digest that other stuff, if you're enchanted by the book and delighted and even laugh, because the best kind of tears come out of when you've been laughing. It's just there's something sublime about that kind of crying.
Absolutely.
Where the whole pageant of life is just mixing up, and that's what I'm always trying to achieve.
When you use a word in the book that I'm probably going to mangle, chiaroscuro.
Chiaroscuro, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Which I think which its meaning is both light and dark at the same time, which I think is a balance that you certainly struck in this. And I'm going to mention a couple of things that I found funny. To the listeners, they won't understand why it's funny unless they read the book. But
it's good to let them know that it's funny.
Yes, it is. Well, it is funny because Honey introduces herself to Josh, and when Josh asks her name, she says Gina Lola Brigida. And of course, I just burst out laughing because I knew who that was. But the best laugh for me came when Josh says to her in a later scene, "Guess who I heard from?" And Honey says, "Jimmy Hoffa." Well, of course, I had been crying just before that, and that sort of dispelled all of that because it was so funny. Jimmy Hoffa was just simply out of the blue. And of course, once again, Josh has no idea who Jimmy Hoffa is simply because of her age.
Yeah, well, it's funny that you said that, because that's, I said how tears to laughter, but I always feel like if, I know this from a playwright too, that if there is extreme emotion, you don't want to milk it. You want to move on. You want to break that because it's almost overwhelming, and there's certain ways in all art forms that if it's pushed too hard, it's too, the pain is, you don't, it's not made into art. It's too difficult.
And
And
I
even
think
though,
yes, I think sometimes some people put it in just for the torture value. That I don't dig, because then I don't have any redemption with it. I want that both back and forth. I want the yin and the
yeah,
yang. So I'm excited to cry and to laugh at the same time.
I'm glad you're my kind of reader then, and I'm
Yes,
glad.
absolutely. One other thing, this is something I heard often growing up, and it's something that I can never highlight enough.
Hmm.
Honey's nephew says, "Forgive him, he doesn't understand." And Honey's response was, "Children understand more than they're given credit for." And that
Hmm.
has been something I heard growing up, and I find it to be so incredibly eye-opening, because people will say, "Well, I don't understand, why is it that why does this child think they remember?" And the answer is because children understand a lot more than they're ever given credit for.
Yeah. No, it's definitely true. I mean, and in terms of like, my own childhood, in many of my books, in the two past books I've written, children have been central characters. In this book, I have an octogenarian, but there's still a lot about Honey's youth. And people are always saying, "Wow, you must have such a great memory of your childhood, because all the details of this life and in New Jersey and of this childhood seem so vivid." And the fact is that I don't at all. Like the events and exactly what happened and what people said or what things even looked like, I don't remember. But I do have a very, very strong memory from early on of how I felt. Like
Yes.
I can be in that house, and even though I can't see it or know exactly what happened, I know exactly what was in my gut, both joy and fear. And so I think a lot of my writing has been trying to invent stories that emotion that I feel, that it can sort of, I can build these fictional architectures that I can put this emotion that I remember from my life into it. The stories are invented, but why they think they feel so real and vivid is because it's infused with very strong emotion from my own life.
I
If that makes
agree.
sense.
And I think it does make sense, because I do think I think children really do remember the emotions. And I think we adults do as well. If someone slaps you across the face, you're going to remember that. If someone gives you a hug on a day that you really, really need a hug, you're going to remember that. It's the emotions we remember so much more vividly than the event. The event might have moved it along. And I will highlight a couple of other little things. So there is a point where Honey runs into Teresa, and she has a
Okay.
bag of plums, and Teresa walks away from her, and Honey says it took basically all of her strength not to hurl a plum at Teresa. And I thought, oh Lord, I've been there before. Separates the humans from the animals, perhaps. But
Yeah.
also the scene where Angela is dying in the hospital and Honey visits her, I thought was one of the most beautiful scenes, in the fact that Honey got a chance to say some things and to let go of some past regret and anger and just let some things go. And I thought that was so wonderful. It's a bit of catharsis for Honey that I didn't see coming, and it was nice to see it when it showed up on the page.
Oh, I'm glad that scene worked for you, because I knew that when this particular character Richie Verona comes up, that I wanted to tell the backstory on what happened. And I thought, I have no idea. I don't really want to do like a flashback scene. I didn't know how it was going to happen. But then when her friend Angela was sick and she went to her deathbed, I just knew that was the moment where it would happen, and it happened very organically. And it's a kind of an odd scene, because like, we learn it from, like, basically it's kind of it's a dialogue with a dying person. It's really a monologue. But when it came out in that situation, I felt really good about it, and it seemed counterintuitive, but it worked really well. So I'm glad that you said that, because I'm very fond and proud of that scene as well.
There's something about it too. I think, Victor, that in life we often want to share our story or tell our side of a story. And in this situation, I'll let the audience know Angela's in a coma, so there isn't a conversation. It is a monologue, as you say. But
Right.
Honey got a chance to share something that she probably never would have been able to share with Angela had Angela not been in a coma, because there would have been a dialogue back and forth, and Angela probably would have shut it down. And so
Right. Yeah.
I felt like Honey got a chance to bare her soul with complete honesty and to say, hey, look, we were both involved in this perceived injury in the past. And,
Mhm.
here we are at the end of our lives. Why don't we let the shit go and move on with life?
Exactly.
So I do want to, is there a Dante's? Because I'm ready to make a reservation.
Well, that's so funny. I had a memory of a place called Dante's from my childhood. It was in Jersey City. And I sort of remember it, probably a little not as fancy as the one in Honey. But I was telling my uncle, my mother's brother, my uncle Frank, actually, he had read the book, an advanced reader's copy, and I was visiting him in New Jersey. And he said, I'll be right back, Victor. And he came with me, and he had this really old ashtray from Casa Dante that he had stolen from the restaurant. It was all cracked. He had glued it
Oh,
together, so I own it now. So I have it home on a little shrine. Um, but so it is. I think it's probably no longer in existence. But that sort of that old world Italian sort of world in Honey, it still exists a little bit in New Jersey, but not like in my childhood. But anyway, to answer your question, Casa Dante's, I have the ashtray to prove that it
I
exists.
love I love
And
that. I love
I love that my uncle stole it too.
He
He probably
borrowed
gave
it.
it to his wife and said, put this in your purse.
Right. He borrowed it. It was
He borrowed it.
for
Yeah.
research. Come on
Yeah.
now.
So,
I love that. Victor, do you have a website or social media you would like to share?
I'm not big on social media, but I do have a website. It's my name, victorlodato.com, and my Instagram is given name Vittorio.
I
So,
love it. I love it.
which is my given name. So I wish I had published under Vittorio, but I started with Victor and kept it. But I like Vittorio because that's my
I
Italian name.
Well, I like it too, and I did love the fact that you named a character after yourself. I'm like, look at you being clever.
I have to make an appearance. So
I love it. Once again, the book is Honey, and it's by Victor Lodato. It is absolutely delicious. Go and get it and read it. Thank you so much, Victor, for joining me on Out with Dan.
thank you, Dan. It's really lovely to talk to you.
Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Out with Dan. You can find more information about this podcast and its host at outwithdan.com, on Twitter at outwithdan, and on Instagram and Facebook at Go Out with Dan. This podcast is hosted by Authors on the Air Global Radio Network, and the theme music is provided by bensound.com. Join us again soon for the next episode of Out with Dan.